Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Navigating the Manosphere, supporting the next generation of young men. Thanks for jumping on during your work days, everyone. We're super excited to bring you today's session. And firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call with us today. Now, tomorrow officially marks 100 days to Mo, which is a major milestone for all of us here at Movember. And from this point on, it's full steam ahead towards the hairy season. We wanted to use this moment to bring our community a little bit closer to some of the groundbreaking work that's happening at the Movember Institute. None of this research would be possible without the incredible support of our fundraising community who show up year after year to help change the face of men's health. So, to all of you, thank you. One of the Mo Institute's key focus areas has been understanding young men's health in today's digital world and exploring how online spaces that they spend time in are shaping their well-being, relationships, and sense of identity. Today's conversation is an important opportunity to share some of those insights with you. And today, we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Krista Fisher. Krista is a global thought leader in young men's mental health and digital culture. As a research fellow at the Movember Institute of Men's Health and an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne, her work explores how digital technologies are reshaping young men's well-being, health, and relationships. Passionate about turning research into real-world impact, Krista works to translate evidence into policy and action. She's dedicated to sparking important conversations, breaking down silos, and driving meaningful change by supporting young men early, helping them to prevent harm and create better outcomes for individuals, families, and communities. Krista, take us away. Very much looking forward to it all.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lockie. Thanks for the great introduction. And for everyone on the call who has given us your time and attention today, we're very grateful and for your ongoing support. I'm really hoping that you get something out of this today. I'm sure you will. And it really is an honor to be able to share some of the hard work that goes on behind the scenes and where the vital money and funds that we raise every year, where that goes and what that helps to drive and the lives that then helps change. So Lockie touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to give an overview of the Movember Institute, which is one big team at Movember. It was a commitment launched in 2023, where we invested and are investing $100 million over the first 5 years of the Movember Institute to bring global experts like myself together to solve some of the world's biggest problems and our most urgent problems related to men's health. So my background is as a young men's mental health expert. I have always been a proud Mo sister, raising money for Movember, running half marathons, then running a half marathon up a mountain. And then when I was finishing my psych honours degree, was fortunate enough actually to attend a Movember community event where my bosses now, Simon Rice and Zach Seidler, were talking about men's mental health, the importance of supporting men in your life, understanding what different types of psychological distress can look like, their masculine norms that men face, and that we really have to challenge and dismantle to help them support their mental health, and also the ways that then supports everyone around them. I was really moved by the work Movember were doing and the knowledge base that existed in men's mental health, and actually reached out to them to see if I could volunteer and support that research. And fortunately for me, at that time, there was a PhD scholarship opportunity, which I applied for and then spent the next 4 years completing my doctorate in young men's anxiety. And then when I completed my PhD, an opportunity with the Movember Institute, as it had just launched, was open. So from there in 2023, I've spent the last 3 years deep in the digital worlds of young men today, which essentially is just a glorified way of saying I spend more than 40 hours a week on TikTok, Reddit, AI, really understanding how these digital worlds are shaping young men's mental health. So I'm really excited to share some of those insights with you all today. And firstly, what's really important is to provide a lay of the land of the state of young men's mental health today. And we know that a number of young men all around the world are struggling with mental health challenges. And adolescence and early adulthood is a really critical time for young people and young men especially. It's when we see psychological illnesses first start to manifest. We know that the biggest risk to a young man's life is himself, aged between 15 to 45 years. That's a really startling and really frightening statistic that we haven't managed to reduce yet. And we know that anxiety and depression can often go undiagnosed in young men. And that's because sometimes we see heightened physical symptoms, we see higher levels of irritability, sometimes a lack of awareness or ability to communicate those challenges. And we know that mental health services aren't always best supported to pick up that distress amongst young men. And so we at Movember do a lot of work in upskilling and educating clinicians on what that psychological distress can look like, what we need to do to engage men in psychological treatment, and also the informal supports in young men's lives. I have a very close personal connection to this work. I saw a number of young men struggling with mental health issues and really felt the ripple effects of that. And that's why I'm so dedicated to doing this work. Um, and in adolescence and early adulthood, we also know that life stresses are a really critical part of that time and that age, where young men are engaging in, initiating, and ending relationships for the first time. They're leaving school, starting university, and those stresses, those highs and lows can be incredibly difficult when there isn't that sense of offline support. There isn't that openness to emotional conversations and vulnerability that we can see for people of other genders in the ways that that's more normalized. And we know that traditional norms of masculinity, these expectations that men need to be self-reliant, that they can't express emotions, that fearlessness, worry, sadness is often something that can be seen as contradictory to the behaviors, the traits, and values that men in Western cultures are expected to embody. And that's still pervasive today. Yes, those norms and stigmas and stereotypes are changing, but we need to do more to propel that change forward. And while the body and field of men's mental health has been growing for the last 2 decades, one very interesting trend that a number of researchers like myself have turned their attention to is understanding the impact of uptakes of these new emergent technologies, such as social media, AI, digital forums, and the ways that this can be an incredible opportunity, an incredible benefit for young men's mental health, but also hold and constitute significant risks and concerns that we need to be aware of. And we see now how many young men are spending time on social media, upwards of 7 hours a day. And that's with digital technologies that can be in the classroom, streaming services, but a big part of that is gaming and social media. So that's one pivotal question that shapes the work that I do, which is really to understand how are these digital technologies, social media and AI, shaping and impacting young men's health, physical health, their mental well-being, and also their relationships. And we did some work last year where we broke down and mapped what this digital landscape looks like for young men today. And I like to show this breakdown to really bring to life the fact that not only is a number of hours in young men's lives spent on social media and digital media, but that this isn't a one app, one platform, one technology issue, that we're seeing these digital worlds much better defined as ecosystems. And for young men, It's better defined as a masculinity digital ecosystem. So we have streamers and gamers showing up on leading podcasts. We have social media platforms showing up and creating content on YouTube, on TikTok, on Reddit as well. So the ways that young men are engaging is both active and passive, in that communication based or conversational based digital technologies are just as popular as TikTok and YouTube and streaming. But that content and the consumption of content is different. And that's really important for us to consider. So, what do young men's digital worlds really look like in 2026? There is more conversation about masculinity, about the manosphere, about young men's mental health than ever before. I know myself, first coming into this space nearly 5 years ago, there was nowhere near, sorry, the attention or conversation around masculinity, around young men's mental health, in the way that there is today. And again, that's good in some ways because we're seeing stigmas challenged, we're seeing more awareness around young men's mental health. But what we're also seeing is this rise of masculinity influences and masculinity content, which engage young men by talking about things that matter to them, like dating, like fitness, like finance, like politics, in a way that is accessible, relatable, that's understandable, and fills this gap of what they have been missing in these offline places. And often the offline supports don't always marry up with the things that are going on in young men's lives. They're not relatable, and they're not engaging them in the way that online sources are. So a lot of you on the call have no doubt heard about the Manosphere. And often we talk about the Manosphere and shows like Adolescence or Louis Theroux's recent Manosphere documentary has highlighted the very real and very serious harms that exist in the Manosphere. But what I really like to do when I talk about the Manosphere and young men's digital worlds today is also give more of a historical context as to where that term first arose from, and what it was used to define. So the Manosphere was first kind of defined or started to be used by academics and journalists when there was this growth and emergence of fringe or online communities where young men and men of all ages really had to sign up for accounts. And there were consistent, I guess, ideological threads or cultures that brought these communities together. So male supremacy, beliefs of the need and advocacy around upholding traditional masculine norms, that men should be primary providers, that they should be the decision makers in households and workplaces, that there are systems now like the courts that are skewed against men. So there were these ideological underpinnings of these groups. And that often provided men who were isolated, struggling up against large social issues, a place to galvanize community, to feel heard, to have some of their questions answered by these very dangerous and very harmful online groups and forums. But as technology has changed and as recommender systems have been embedded into social media and other types of digital technologies, influences, content, ideologies that was once confined to these online communities now started showing up on platforms where you didn't necessarily have to do anything. And researchers showed this other than create an account as a young man, 16 to 18 years old, to be fed content that is associated or speaks to incel culture or incel groups, which is part of the manosphere, involuntarily celibate men, men's rights activism, suicide, self-harm content, drug use content. And that's very different from that active signing up to be part of these online communities, to creating an account and encountering that content on your feed. And so the way that we talk about the manosphere now is very different, and the way that we're defining it now is very different to its origins. And now the manosphere, or mainstream masculinity content, has really molded and merged with self-optimization and self-improvement, where men's lifestyle and culture has become such an integral part of the way we're talking about and understanding the manosphere. And there is a lot of alarm about the manosphere, and understandably, when we're seeing the real world harms arising from this online content, where teachers in classrooms are reporting sexual harassment and environments of misogyny. We need to take all of that very seriously. Equally, there is a really critical part to being able to intervene, educate, and ultimately prevent the manosphere from causing these offline harms, by actually speaking to young men to understand, why is this content rising in the way that it is? How do we build that sense of critical discernment when this content arises on their feeds? How they can think about and interrogate some of the stuff they're seeing, and also what those offline harms look like for them, when we're seeing it so closely linked to self-optimization and self-improvement. A lot of physical health behaviors are also changing by result of some of this content and some of these influences. So that's the work that we've really been doing over the last few years. And a recent study that I'm really excited to share with you all has recently been published. And this was a step forward for us as a field to be able to not only understand how quickly algorithmic systems deliver dangerous and harmful content tied to the manosphere to young men, but to actually look at the TikTok feeds of young men themselves. Because the problem with some of that research that was creating dummy accounts and seeing how quickly different types of content, different types of ideologies are sent to young male accounts, is that tech companies will say and criticize that work as not necessarily being reflective of real life user experiences. So, for example, that's not how young men use and show up on TikTok. So that was what we really wanted to do, was understand and collect those insights from young men. And we did. We recruited 142 young men who shared their past month TikTok viewing histories with us. So that's a lot of data, as you can imagine, almost 1 million videos. And we did that at 2 time points, baseline, and then we followed them up again in 6 months' time. So when we were doing this research, one hurdle that we came up against, and speaks to a larger problem with our kind of conversations and our approach to the manosphere, has been, it's very hard to define. It's not a binary thing where young men are either in the manosphere or not, or these videos are manosphere content or not. And actually, what we're starting to see with this mainstream manosphere is that it's much better defined as a spectrum, where there are ideological extremes, but there are also cultural touch points that make this content so engaging, and so kind of inciting in some ways to young men. So what we did with that TikTok data that young men shared with us was, myself and my team watched hours of this content, 2,000 videos from that TikTok data set, to actually build out what we have called a masculinity content classification framework. So this is that step forward from just defining the manosphere as Andrew Tate videos or male supremacy videos, as something that really breaks down what are the cultural parts of these videos and the health behaviors and ideologies that come through in these videos, that can kind of constitute that broader umbrella of this mainstream manosphere now. So I'm going to show and share some of those videos with you that really bring this masculinity content classification framework to life. So the first tier, cultural touch points, this is where we see the majority this is what we see the majority of young men engaging with. These are seemingly ordinary videos to do with men's lifestyle and culture. But these videos are directly made and directly targeting a young male audience. Masculine status, the second tier of content, that's where we start to see some of those messages and some of those ideologies around masculinity, around what manhood looks like, around relationships, and the expectations and behaviors that men should be living up to, where those threads and narratives really start to come through. And then the last tier of content, degrading health, you can see that was the least prevalent tier of videos in our data set. But importantly, a lot of the content, a lot of the themes that come through with this degrading health content are what we typically associate the manosphere with. And all of these videos violate TikTok's community guidelines. I update this presentation deck every time I have a webinar or speak at a conference, and these videos are still up there. So what that speaks to is the fact that regulation and moderation of this content isn't enough, that these videos still get millions and millions of views, and we need to do more to actually understand why and how that content can still exist. So enough talking, I'm going to show these videos to you, which will do a much better job of bringing that framework to life.
And they got the nerve to talk back.
Yep. Hang on.
More time that you will be able to understand who you are.
Follow pop culture enough to know. Everyone's like, man, if Eminem hits you with a diss track, his diss tracks are crazy.
The biggest mistake that people make when they're networking or spending time around other people or letting other people get to know them is what I call leaving their boots in the suitcase.
Men to the left, because women are always right.
This with a 4.19 in the shuttle. That's a great time for a guy his size.
Right. And then we've got tier two, the masculine status content.
Am I happy? I don't know. Never really thought about it. Don't really care about it. Because all I really cared about was when I looked in that fucking mirror, I saw a piece of shit. How many girls?
I got 2 girls.
Two?
And they both loyal.
They both loyal?
Oh.
This fucking knows a man about it. Being a man.
The next thing to give up if you want to be rich is women. As a man, if you take a woman out to dinner, you pay for it. There's no questions, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that.
Never trust a woman that you're dating who puts a lot of effort and emphasis into her social media.
You could go for fun.
We can go M for M. I got a body like him and them.
All right. And then the last tier.
And they got the nerve to talk back to me. What the fuck do you think is going to happen, y'all?
Gonna catch me tripping on a bitch unless she on the floor. There ain't 2 things I ain't never seen. That's the turtle with speed and a bitch I need.
Why would I want to be with a bum?
How come no man in this room has ever said that about a girl they dated? Because you're all gold-digging skanks.
My advice for all you young bodybuilders is that if you don't see any results after the first day at the gym, start blasting steroids immediately.
If your girl's overseas for the summer, she's definitely on her fucking knees with a different fella.
Are you a teenager?
I'm 24.
Too old. Expired.
And so why this framework was so important and the contribution that it made is not only to give us a more kind of granular language to actually talk about, describe, and understand the nature of content itself, rather than just what influences are typically associated with the manosphere. It also gives us as researchers and policymakers a way to better categorize and code the types of videos that exist in this space. And it makes a significant contribution in helping us understand why and how this degrading health content shows up when it does, because there are cultural touch points that almost constitute the cultural packaging in some ways through which the extreme health behaviors or extreme ideologies are then sold and come through. Now, two big domains in young men's digital worlds, and that Movember are particularly interested in, is fitness and finance. And that's because we know fitness behaviors have a direct link to men's physical health, but we also see heightened risk-taking behaviors amongst young men, and that those trends are pretty consistent. Things like substance use, alcohol, risky driving, unsafe sex practices, that has for a number of years and consistently across the evidence base shown up higher amongst young men than young women or people of other genders. And for fitness and health and exercise related behaviors, often men's body image concerns, muscle dysmorphia, eating challenges, extreme exercise, that can go untalked about, and there is still significant stigma that surrounds those physical appearance issues. And social media is absolutely playing a role in that. So when Movember are doing work to think about young men's mental health and physical health, we knew that addressing this narrative and this domain of young men's digital worlds is a big area of focus for us. And what I want to do is also show the way that these domains of fitness and then finance come up and look differently across those tiers of the masculinity content classification framework. So something like a tricep pull down video doesn't seem that harmful in any way.
You want to know the real reason why we go to the gym? I'll tell you what, we don't go to the gym just for bigger muscles. We don't go to the gym just for more defined abs. No, we go to the gym to prove to ourselves that we're capable of more than we ever thought was possible. Because every single rep I do past failure, it's a direct reminder that I can do more than I ever thought I could do. And that translates to every single area in life. I go to the gym so that I can prove that I can be disciplined and committed to something so that my girlfriend can look at me and say, wow, he can be disciplined and committed to me.
And then we see the way that men's bodies and men's physical appearance is directly positioned as something reflective of discipline and the type of role that they should then live up to in relationships. And dominance and physical power is not only normalized, but glorified as something that young men should kind of adhere to.
You guys should not be taking any peptides because the long-term effects are super scary. The fact that these vials can get you leaner, shredded, and get you more bitches is scary.
And we're seeing within this fitness domain of young men's digital worlds, peptides and other unregulated substances becoming a really big issue. Social media is not only a place where it's normalized, but young men are also kind of bombarded with misinformation around dosage, around evidence base that is underlying these peptides, which is none, if any. And they're also directly sourcing peptides and other physical or image appearance related substances and compounds through those social media channels, through direct distributors or through labs that pose and call themselves research laboratories where you can buy needles and these compounds from. And looks maxing is now another term, a bit like the manosphere, that is kind of starting to enter our public discourse around young men's digital worlds. And looks maxing communities were again one of those sub-communities in the origins of the manosphere, where influencers and pages like looksmaxing.org or looksmaxing.com, a whole range of different modifications of that, spoke to and essentially framed all men's physical appearance as an indication of their worth and value. That ascending as a man physically through the way that your face looks or your physical body, your exercise and diet, all those kinds of things, not only means you look better, but means that you will get the things that you want in work, in life, and in relationships. So again, the norms of dominance, male supremacy, all those things start to filter through in these communities as well. And now we'll turn to finance too to have a look at this as another domain.
Welcome to Monica.
So sports, cars, Formula One, that's one thing that we know is largely made up of a young male audience base. And then lastly, degrading. So in the way that we've also seen peptides and other risky health behaviors rise and become much more popular and concerning in young men's digital worlds, finance and hustle culture, financial exploitation in particular, is another big risk where we're seeing finance influencers or day trading, crypto investors, and schemes promising to make young men money, becoming something that TikTok isn't, and a whole range of other social media platforms isn't effectively able to regulate. A lot of young men that we spoke to in this research have themselves or had friends who have lost money from these schemes. And also kind of exacerbated concerns around gambling, around that financial risk taking. And that was profiled quite a lot in Louis Theroux's Manosphere documentary too. So the next big question is, well, what do young men think about this? Now that we understand a little bit more about the types of content that they're engaging with and the ways that that exists on a spectrum, what do they think and how are they encountering it? So last year we published a report called Young Men's Health in a Digital World, and we surveyed 3,000 or just over 3,000 young men in Australia, UK and the US to understand the masculinity influences that they're engaging with and the ways that that is shaping their health outcomes. So more than 2/3 of that 3,000 sample of young men said that they were regularly engaging with one or more masculinity influencer online. And when we look at why and what they liked most about this content, the masculinity content that these influencers were creating, is that young men found them entertaining, motivating, and inspiring. And that's a really important point, is that we can't underestimate the value of entertainment. It's not just about unmet needs that are then being fulfilled on social media. It's the creative tenets of this content that makes it not only aspirational, but entertaining and a form of escape for young men. And when we asked about the ways that they felt like masculinity influences were impacting their life, young men were more likely to report influences having a positive benefit on their lives than negative. And the real world change that masculinity influences are eliciting in young men is evident here as well. 38% of young men said that they had acted upon masculinity influences advice. So it's not just entertaining or recreational content. Young men are listening to these influencers and acting upon the advice that they hear in these spaces. And young men engaging with masculinity influences were more likely to report feeling optimistic about their personal circumstances and the social circumstances for young men over the next 5 years at high levels. When we compared them to young men who weren't engaging with masculinity influences. So they had higher levels of optimism, of hope, of, yeah, feeling like things were on the upwards trajectory. But when we looked at their mental health outcomes, their levels of worthlessness, depression, restlessness, young men engaging with masculinity influences regularly had higher levels of that psychological distress in comparison to young men who weren't engaging with these masculinity influences. So, those engaging with masculinity influences, on one hand, felt more optimistic or had that sense of hope, but on the other hand, were reporting high levels and serious levels of psychological distress. We also saw high levels of risk-taking behaviors. Young men engaging with masculinity influences were twice as likely to be using steroids, testosterone injections, exercising whilst injured, a whole range of different physical health risks. And were reporting higher levels of dating frustrations, social isolation, feeling like they wanted a relationship, but were equally kind of distrustful and uncertain about their ability to actually get that. I did touch on this already, but I want to bring our attention to the negative attitudes that young men engaging with masculinity influences reported when we asked them about women, about feminism, about their experiences dating and relating with women in the world. And this is where the offline harms become crystal clear for us, that this isn't just an issue that is affecting young men. It is affecting people of every gender, every sexuality. And these ideologies and messages that young men are consuming here is calcifying these very harmful attitudes and pessimistic attitudes about women. And startlingly, more young men who were engaging with masculinity influences were actually in a committed relationship already. So they had a romantic companion, it may not have been a woman, but who in their real lives were potentially challenging some of these ideologies and messages that they were seeing online, yet it was still resonating with them in the way that they were reporting very high endorsement of some of these messages. 70% of young men engaging with masculinity influences saying or believing that women have it easier than men. Around the same 70% saying women use feminism to keep men down, and 67% saying women should fulfill their traditional roles as wives or mothers. So this is something that we need to take really seriously. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to whip through this, but this is a new study that I'm very excited to say has just been released for preprint, so you can go and read this. But that is kind of a follow-up to the work that we were doing with the masculinity content classification framework with the 142 young men, where we asked them the question of what do they think about men and masculinity content. And two themes came through quite clearly from this research, in that there was real benefit for young men in the blueprint for masculine self-development that a lot of this content provided them. That they found the practical tips around fitness, finance, dating, and mental health really motivational, but also practically implementable in their lives. And that was where the value came from. So some of these guys here saying, one of these guys, sorry, saying that my favorite TikTok content is the content that revolves around gym and masculinity. It reminds me there is something I could go and do that would make me feel better emotionally. And when I look after my body, I feel better. And the other kind of tension point with this theme was that young men were also highlighting and very aware of the harms and risks that exist here, where financial exploitation was directly called out and named by men as a problem, where there were messages that they felt like were very harmful for young men in particular about the way that their body should look, the ways that responsibility was individualized, that broader structural barriers were dismissed or not taken as seriously. And young men were aware of the very toxic ideologies that existed in this space as well. A lot of them were saying, yes, there is the good stuff, the gym, the motivational stuff, the content that feels like, to me, talks about how to look after my mental health. But there's a other side of it that's really toxic, that is misogynistic, that turns or exploits men to becoming alpha males. And so those exclusivist ideologies were often, from young men's perspectives, evident in videos that seemed like comedy, that could easily dismissed as something that wasn't that serious. It was a throwaway comment. But young men did have the critical ability and were actively discerning those harmful messages as they arose. But interestingly, when young men were talking about the potential harms of misogyny, of those, toxic ideologies, it was often through the lens of other young men. So vulnerable young men who might be younger, going through a breakup, but very few, one or two, was ever able to tie it to it had a harmful impact on me, or I worry about myself when I'm low, that I may be falling kind of prey to some of these harmful messages. So to finish up, before we get some questions from you all and answer some of the questions that you've already sent through, I want to finish with a little bit more of a what we do about it and where are we moving to from here. And looking ahead, there are 5 critical pillars that we at Movember and that the field are talking about prioritizing for intervention and prevention. Firstly, that we can't just address this content because this content is going to be out there. We've seen the social media ban implemented in Australia. The evaluation of that is ongoing, but not looking overly positive. So young men are going to be consuming this content. Where we can have a impact in stopping the flow-on effects of some of these messages is meeting young men's needs, that is making them so susceptible to some of these harmful actors, this harmful content online. So the advice that they're missing, the practical kind of blueprints for masculine success that doesn't just demonize masculinity, but gives them something to aspire to, that is evidence-based information around finance, around fitness, around dating, things that they care about, that they're navigating, often with this lack of engaging and relatable support and guidance for them. Secondly, that this desire amongst young men for information, conversation, and community about masculinity, about mental health, about how to improve and optimize yourself, that is incredibly positive. A lot of these topics are things that traditionally men stereotypically may not have talked about, that it was something that was, heavily stereotyped as anti-masculine or overly feminine. So we need to lean into that. We need to leverage that desire for self-improvement and for this ability for men to care about the vulnerability amongst other young men who are isolated, single, younger, who may be susceptible to some of these messages, and encourage them to be good digital citizens. If they're seeing this toxic content, if they're seeing misogyny play out online, if they're seeing the online pile-ons, to call it out and to be aware of other young men in their worlds who may be falling victim to that. Alter narratives through digital and real world interventions. A big part of what Movember are doing is investing in healthier masculinity content that speaks to issues like finance and fitness and things that men care about, but in a way that is giving them healthier versions of masculinity to live up to, more flexible rather than rigid messages and narratives. But real world interventions are so key. Yes, digital environments and digital worlds are a big part of how young men form their masculine identities, but so too are schools, their families, their friends, their sporting communities. So we need to show up in those offline spaces as well. Highlight these tension points and contradictions. The fact that some young men think that this content may be serving them. They might think that these dating coaches or fitness schemes and advice is beneficial for them, but actually highlighting the fact that you might, and a lot of young men consuming this content are actually feeling worse off about themselves, that maybe in the long term, those short-term advices and 10-step regimes aren't actually going to help them in the long run or sustainable. And lastly, holding systems and young men accountable. So tech systems, I mean, they're billion-dollar industries. We are really fighting an uphill battle. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth the fight. It is. And we need to think about ways that we can do that, where experts like myself are partnering with tech developers, with product developers to ensure that safety by design principles are not a nice to have, it's a must have. And that the citizens and consumers of these products, their safety is considered right from the start, not just through moderation and regulation policies. And holding young men accountable. The online harm that we're seeing is serious and it needs to be addressed. And young men need to be empowered to know what levers are at their disposal, that you can reset your algorithm, that you can opt out of hashtags or influencers that aren't making you feel good, and that there are ways to be better digital citizens. So I'll leave it there, but I really look forward to answering some of your questions too.
Amazing, Krista. Incredibly insightful. I've got no doubt there'll be a lot of people on the call where all this is very new information as well. And I think, even just sharing those TikToks would be brand new content to people. And some of the stats around the level of influence are so insightful. And something that I was reflecting on a little bit throughout the call was, I guess, the rate at which people are consuming this content as well. Like, people are swiping through hundreds and hundreds of TikToks in one session, which is super alarming. So thanks so much for running us through that. We've got a bit of a Q&A section. So we did have a number of people submit questions, which is really amazing. So thank you for that. But we do also have the chat box available now. So as we run through these, feel free to fire a few questions in there and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. I guess the first question, how does Movember's work here connect to its broader mental health and suicide prevention mission?
Yeah, so this is directly related to Movember's broader mission. When I talked at the start about social media and digital technologies, what we often see is young men who get the greatest benefit from this are young men who are isolated, who may not have the level of literacy and language around their mental health challenges. So we need to ensure that those who are going to get the greatest benefit from these digital technologies are kind of supported to do that, but that these online harms are taken seriously and addressed as well.
Yeah, some of that you mentioned at the end about opting out of hashtags, like that's new information to me. So it's obviously super important that we get that out there. What initiatives is Movember building right now to address this type of thing, and how can partners or workplaces directly get involved or support that work?
Yeah, this is one that I actually prepared for earlier. So one of the direct programmatic initiatives that has taken off from this research is what is called the Young Men's Media Collective. So our team are working to establish and have established a network of people who are either understanding and investigating young men's digital worlds or actively shaping them. So we have a convening network all from experts all over the world who getting insights from our research and our digital listening and ongoing qualitative interviews and quant research to track one narrative, which I touched on today, which we're seeing dominating young men's digital worlds, which is this idea that young men need to be relentlessly rich and ripped at all costs. And what we're doing with this Young Men's Media Collective is we are funding 9 grantees to create content or shape initiatives and interventions which either challenge that narrative or create healthier content, which speaks to those fitness and finance themes, but in a way that is more evidence-based. And what we're doing with those 9 partners is sharing out what works and what doesn't to everyone else to ensure that those insights can then filter down and that we can all actively shape these healthier digital worlds for young men. So that's one thing that I would encourage you all to look up and reach out to if you want to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly that, in places like the Movember Institute are coming up with this type of thing, because the content has, I guess, really quickly seeped into people's algorithms. So that's amazing. And next question, what early warning signs should parents, teachers, or managers look out for in a young man who might be engaging with this type of content?
Yeah, this is the question that I get asked probably the most at every presentation that I do. And I think often about that scene from adolescence where the young boy is communicating with his dad about the Manosphere, and his dad's a police officer. And there was a text message thread that the young guy was like, clearly he was getting bullied, but the dad and the police officer didn't see it because it was emojis and like these different terms and things that are relevant to a young guy, but not at all to a 50-year-old guy. And I think part of it is just understanding the influences, the viral trends, the terminology and things that young men are seeing on social media. And that can be hard when you're not spending the time that I am, for example, in this content and in these digital worlds. The second part that I would say, though, is approaching these conversations from a place of curiosity. So not coming at conversations with young men in our lives armored up with these terms and with these influences and things, but actually posing questions to them and letting their terminology, their words guide how we have conversations about masculinity and about the manosphere. So I would say just opening it up and not necessarily assuming that all young men on social media are radicalized. Like we need to be very aware that there is a spectrum here, and that a young guy online is almost certainly encountering a Joe Rogan, an Andrew Tate, a Jordan Peterson. So just because they are seeing that content doesn't necessarily mean that they are endorsing or agreeing with the messages that they're seeing. And actually, what we can do, we can't beat Joe Rogan. He has millions and millions of young men listening to his every single episode. What we can do is help them build up a muscle within themselves to think, do I agree with that? How does that sit with my personal values? And that's where we can really kind of have these real world impacts and have empathetic but also accountable offline conversations. That's what we need to be having.
Yeah, it's such an interesting approach to it, because so much of the instinct surrounding, I guess, negative content is like, how can we stop it and how can we stop it now, when it's clearly a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next question, how can parents support teenage kids going through breakups and emotionally confusing periods of their lives?
Yeah. Again, being available and noticing the signs is a big one. I really like this saying, ask how are you twice? Because I think the instinct sometimes, if you know that a young guy in your life has gone through a breakup, it's like, how are you going? They're going to say good. But it's probing that little bit, or just leaving them with a sense of, if you want to talk about it, I'm here and I'm listening, I'm not judging. And I also think like using things that you might encounter as an inroad to open up that conversation. The Man Cave and Hunter, who set up the Man Cave, has a really good term called the Trojan horse. And sometimes having things that you can use, like, for example, an episode that you might all be watching together, to start a conversation about gender roles in relationships rather than, coming to your 10-year-old son being like, well, how do you want to show up as a husband in the future? Like, then there's an immediate disconnect there. So sometimes if you can use little hooks to actually open up those conversations, that can be a really powerful inroads. And listening and like non-judgmental support is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. So, something worth mentioning as well. One of our online resources here at Movember Conversations, runs through the ALEC conversation model, which is an acronym for ask, listen, encourage action, and check in. So I guess if you're a parent, friend, brother, whatever it is on the session today and you're thinking about going to have one of those conversations, I'd really recommend, just Googling Movember Conversations and having a look through that resource as well, just as an added thing in the arsenal.
Yeah, great call.
What does a healthier or more expansive vision of masculinity actually look like in practice, whether it's, a workplace, school, or in a family setting?
Yeah, this is another great plug to some other broader work at the Movember Institute, led by some of my colleagues in the US, Brian, Pete, and Joe, who are looking to develop a new measure and definition of healthy manhood. A lot of the conversations around masculinity in academia and in the media even is talking about how men shouldn't be and the ways they shouldn't act, which is important. But often what we lack is the supplementary, what should they be doing? What does healthy masculinity look like? And so the team are doing some incredible work. You can look at the Movember Institute to find out a little bit more about that, and trying to break healthy manhood down across the different domains of men's life: physical health, relationships, sexual health, finance, because it is a multifaceted, multidimensional thing. It can't be summarized in one sentence. How I like to think about it, though, is aspiring for flexibility rather than rigidity. So some norms and behaviors that have traditionally been associated with masculinity, control, discipline, stoicism, that's not inherently harmful by any means. It's just knowing when to lean into that and when to also allow yourself to seek help, to be emotional, to uplift the rights of other people in your life as well.
Yeah, I guess it sort of comes back to that fact of, being open to some of these more new ideas of masculinity versus some of the more traditional discussion that's obviously happened through the past. And yeah, like you mentioned before, trying to be a part of that solution as well. For organizations just starting to add in initiatives around mental health and online content, what's one practical step they could take to support young men on this issue?
Mm. I even think, a bit like what you said, Lockie, that there is so much that we can do to craft and curate our online worlds that we don't know about. So I think, like, even if organizations invested in a digital health initiative or day or workshop in the same way that we are pioneering forward conversations and awareness about mental health and physical health, I think that could be a really powerful a step for organizations. And there is so much that we can do: set screen time, set limits, kind of going through and culling our follower list, or resetting algorithms. So there are some very practical steps that they can take, and the list of resources that we'll be sending out after this webinar does provide some of those guidelines and recommendations as well.
Yeah, there are definitely so many options. My partner at the moment is using the brick method, where
Yes.
you have to go up to the fridge to unlock your screen time, which is impressively effective, to be honest. But massive thanks, Krista. It was incredibly insightful, and I'm sure everyone on the call would feel the same. And Conscious that we have run out of time, so we will be sending through a follow-up email with some of those resources that Krista has mentioned today. And there'll also be an opportunity for members of the audience to give feedback on the session today, where we're super keen to understand what you guys want to hear, what you want to learn about, what you want to know more of in these types of sessions going forward. And we'll also be shooting through the recording as well. So we really encourage you guys to share it with your workplace, share it with your friends, show your kids, and really sort of continue that conversation. And it's pretty special to have this many people on the call. And by virtue of just joining this type of session, you guys are a part of the movement, and we are in this together, trying to change the face of men's health. And can't thank everyone enough for today. And obviously, a massive thank you to Krista as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.